It's past midnight, and the highway is dead. The usual hum of traffic has long since faded, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. The streetlights cast long, sinister shadows on the asphalt, their dim glow barely cutting through the thick darkness that seems to envelop everything. It's just me and the road, a seemingly endless stretch of nothingness that should have been comforting in its familiarity. But tonight, something feels different. Something feels off. I've been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue, but I'm almost home. Just a little longer, I tell myself. The thought of a warm bed is the only thing keeping me going. Suddenly, I notice flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. The sight of those lights jolts me awake like a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart. My mind races. Was I speeding? I don't think so. Did I miss a stop sign? No, that doesn't seem right either. I pull over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The highway is desolate, just me and those piercing lights cutting through the darkness. The isolation of this place makes the situation even more unnerving. As the car behind me stops, a figure emerges. Relief washes over me momentarily. At least, it's just a cop. He's dressed in a dark uniform, a badge glinting on his belt under the faint glow of the streetlights. But as he approaches, something about him feels wrong. His movements are too deliberate, too calculated, as if every step is part of some unspoken ritual. His demeanor is too aggressive, his words too rushed, as if he's struggling to maintain control of something simmering beneath the surface. License and registration, he demands, his voice a gruff whisper that sends a shiver down my spine. I hand them over, my hands trembling slightly. There's something in his eyes, something cold and menacing, that makes my skin crawl. He stares at me for a moment, as if sizing me up, before turning back to his car. As he walks away, I can't shake the feeling that I've just narrowly avoided something terrible. I sit there, my heart pounding in my ears, my mind racing. Every instinct I have is screaming at me that something isn't right. I reach for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there's no signal. I'm trapped here, on this dark, desolate highway, with no way to call for help. Minutes pass like hours, and then I see him returning. But something has changed. His approach is slower, more deliberate, and there's a disturbing gleam in his eyes. His once official demeanor has vanished, replaced by a chilling coldness that sends a wave of dread through me. It's as if he's dropped a mask, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. "You need to follow me," he says, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your registration. There's a problem." The way he says it, the way he looks at me, it's not a request. It's a command, a cold, calculated command. My mind is racing, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I know I can't follow him. Everything in me is screaming to get away, to run. As he turns back toward his car, something inside me snaps. I throw the car into drive, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turn white. The tires screech as I slam my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life. The world outside becomes a blur as I speed away, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I don't look back. I can't. Every fiber of my being is focused on getting away from him. The highway stretches out before me, an endless ribbon of darkness. The fear is like a physical presence in the car with me, sitting in the passenger seat, whispering in my ear. My mind is a whirlwind of panic and dread. Who was he? What did he want? And why did it feel like he was chasing me? I can hear the faint roar of an engine behind me, and I know without looking that it's him. He's following me, his car looming like a predator in the night. The thought sends another wave of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I push the gas pedal harder, but the fear is still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Miles pass in a blur of terror and speed. The road seems to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around me. I can feel his presence behind me, like a shadow that I can't escape. Every instinct tells me that I need to keep going, that I need to get away from him. But there's a part of me that wonders if I'll ever really be safe again. Then, out of nowhere, I see it, a small all-night diner, its neon sign flickering in the distance like a beacon of hope. It's the first sign of civilization I've seen in what feels like hours. Without thinking, I swerve into the parking lot, the tires screeching as I come to a halt. For a moment, everything is silent. My heart is pounding, my hands shaking as I watch his car speed past on the highway, disappearing into the night. Relief washes over me like a wave, but it's tempered by a lingering fear that I can't shake. I'm safe for now, but the encounter has left a mark on me, a scar that I know will never fully heal. I sit in the car, my breathing ragged, my mind still reeling from what just happened. Eventually, I gather the courage to step out of the car and walk into the diner. The warm, fluorescent lights are a stark contrast to the darkness outside, and the smell of coffee and greasy food fills the air. It's almost comforting. The few patrons inside glance at me briefly before returning to their meals, unaware of the terror I've just escaped. I find a seat at the counter, my mind still racing. The waitress asks if I want anything, but I barely hear her. All I can think about is that man, the cold, calculating look in his eyes, the way he spoke to me, the way he tried to lure me into following him. It all feels like a bad dream, but I know it was real. Later, when I finally manage to calm down enough to call the police, I tell them everything. They listen, but I can hear the skepticism in their voices. It's clear they think I'm overreacting, that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But I know better. I know what I saw, and I know that man wasn't who he claimed to be. Days later, the police contact me with an update. They tell me they've identified the man. He wasn't a cop. He was an imposter, someone with a criminal record who had been posing as an officer to prey on vulnerable people. The revelation is both a relief and a new source of fear. I was lucky to get away, but the knowledge that he's still out there somewhere leaves me with a lingering sense of dread. To this day, I can't drive down a dark highway without feeling that same cold fear creeping up my spine. Every time I see flashing lights in my rearview mirror, I feel that same panic, that same overwhelming sense of danger. I know I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I never imagined that a routine drive home could turn into a nightmare, but life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. It was a late Thursday evening, and I had just wrapped up a marathon of meetings. My head was still spinning from the endless discussions, negotiations, and decisions made in the boardroom. All I could think about was getting home to my wife and daughter, collapsing on the couch, and leaving the stress of the day behind. The city was alive that night, as it always was. The streets were a blur of headlights, neon signs, and the constant hum of traffic. The familiar route home usually brought me a sense of comfort, a transition from the chaos of work to the sanctuary of home. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, something I couldn't quite place. As I drove, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, I noticed the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. A police car, signaling me to pull over. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't panic. I wasn't speeding, and my car was in perfect order. This was probably just a routine check. I had nothing to hide. I slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road, my hands instinctively gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The officer stepped out of his car and began walking toward me. Something about him didn't sit right with me. His uniform was correct, down to the last detail, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was the way the badge looked slightly tarnished, or the fact that his movements were too deliberate, too calculated. A cold shiver ran down my spine as he reached my window. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice devoid of any warmth or familiarity. I could feel his eyes boring into me, searching for any sign of weakness. His presence was overwhelming, like a predator stalking its prey. I fumbled for my wallet, my fingers trembling as I handed over the documents. He snatched them from me without so much as a nod. As he walked back to his car, the unease in my stomach grew. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The city noises seemed distant now, as if the world had been put on mute, leaving only the pounding of my heart to fill the silence. Minutes passed. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, waiting for him to return. When he finally did, there was a darkness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. A glint of something malevolent, something dangerous. "You're carrying drugs, aren't you?" he asked suddenly, his voice calm, but with an edge that made my blood run cold. My breath caught in my throat. What was he talking about? I'd never touched drugs in my life. "No, officer, I'm not." "There must be some mistake," I stammered, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to remain composed. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, my mind racing. This wasn't right. But what could I do? Refusing would only make things worse. With shaky hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. The city seemed different now, more menacing. The usual comforting glow of the streetlights felt oppressive. The shadows darker, more threatening. The officer circled my car, his eyes scanning every inch of it. Then, without warning, he began tearing through my belongings. He threw my briefcase onto the ground, papers scattering across the asphalt. He rifled through the glove compartment, pulling out a wad of cash I had withdrawn earlier that day to pay rent. "This yours?" he asked, holding up the money. His tone was accusatory, his eyes gleaming with something that made my stomach churn. "Yes, it's mine. I withdrew it for rent," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I knew what was coming. He sneered, pocketing the cash without another word. My heart sank. This wasn't a cop. This was a criminal in disguise. Panic surged through me, but I was frozen, unable to move, unable to think. How had I ended up in this situation? How had I gone from a simple drive home to standing on the side of the road, helpless, as this man stole from me? He finished his search, throwing the rest of my belongings back into the car with casual disregard. Then, without warning, he shoved me back towards the driver's seat. "Get in," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. I stumbled, barely catching myself before falling. I did as I was told, sliding back into the driver's seat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The officer gave me one last look, his eyes filled with a promise of violence if I made the wrong move. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, his patrol car speeding off into the night. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I'd been robbed, humiliated, and left with nothing but fear and confusion. The city, my city, felt foreign to me now. The streets that had once been so familiar were now tainted with the memory of that night, the night when everything changed. The police were of little help. They took my statement, launched an investigation, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't expect to find him, and they didn't. The man who had posed as an officer, who had robbed me in plain sight, vanished into the shadows of the city. Just another unsolved case, another victim left to pick up the pieces. In the weeks that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, my trust in the world around me shattered. I couldn't drive down that road without feeling the panic rising in my chest. The city, once vibrant and alive, was now a place of danger, filled with shadows where threats could lurk unseen. That night left a scar on me, one that has never fully healed. Every time I see a police car, I'm reminded of the man who wore a uniform, but was anything but a protector. He was a predator, and I was his prey. And the worst part, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. The shadows in the city are darker than I ever imagined, and now I know what hides within them. The police were of little help. They took my statement, launched an investigation, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't expect to find him, and they didn't. The man who had posed as an officer, who had robbed me in plain sight, vanished into the shadows of the city. Just another unsolved case, another victim left to pick up the pieces. In the weeks that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, my trust in the world around me shattered. I couldn't drive down that road without feeling the panic rising in my chest. The city, once vibrant and alive, was now a place of danger, filled with shadows where threats could lurk unseen. That night left a scar on me, one that has never fully healed. Every time I see a police car, I'm reminded of the man who wore a uniform but was anything but a protector. He was a predator, and I was his prey. And the worst part, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. The shadows in the city are darker than I ever imagined, and now I know what hides within them. I never thought a road trip could turn into a nightmare. Emily and I had been planning this adventure for months. We were excited to drive from California to New York, exploring the open road and soaking in every sight America had to offer. Our car was packed with snacks, a playlist full of our favorite songs, and a camera to capture the memories we planned to make. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened on that lonely stretch of highway. It was late afternoon when we found ourselves driving through the middle of nowhere, surrounded by vast desert landscapes. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. It was beautiful, almost too perfect, like something out of a dream. Emily was taking pictures out the window, laughing at the way the light played off the rocks and sand. We were happy, carefree, lost in the moment. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed a car approaching fast in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. People speed all the time on these open roads, but as it got closer, I started to feel uneasy. It was a dark sedan, unmarked, but it had flashing red and blue lights. "David, are we being pulled over?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "I think so," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I eased off the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. The lights were blinding, casting strange shadows inside our car. Something about it felt wrong. We weren't speeding. We hadn't broken any laws. A man stepped out of the car and started walking toward us. He wore a police uniform, but it was disheveled, almost as if he'd thrown it on in a hurry. His movements were slow, deliberate, and there was something off about the way he carried himself. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked at us with a strange, unsettling intensity. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice flat, yet somehow aggressive. I handed them over, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I could feel her tension. Something wasn't right. The man claimed we had a broken tail light, which I knew was a lie. Our car was in perfect condition. We'd checked everything before leaving. "Stay here," he ordered, before walking back to his car. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily and I exchanged worried glances. "This doesn't feel right, David. I have a really bad feeling about this," Emily whispered. I nodded, my mind racing. There was something off about this guy. The way he looked at us, the way he spoke. It was all wrong. I had a gut feeling that we needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he sat in his car, doing nothing. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. When he finally returned, he didn't give us back our IDs. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Follow me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned and walked back to his car without another word. I hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me to drive away, but my mind was battling with the idea of defying someone who appeared to be an officer. Emily squeezed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "David, don't. Let's just drive." That was all I needed to hear. Slowly I pulled back onto the highway. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and sure enough, the dark sedan was following us, its lights still flashing. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart was racing, a mix of fear and adrenaline. Emily kept looking over her shoulder, watching the car behind us, her breathing quick and shallow. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep looking for a sign of civilization," I replied, trying to sound calm, but my voice shook with the effort. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the dark road stretching endlessly before us. The sun had fully set, plunging us into a terrifying darkness. The once beautiful desert now felt like a trap, an empty void that threatened to swallow us whole. Finally, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of lights. A gas station. It was like seeing an oasis in the middle of a desert. I pressed down on the gas, speeding toward it, praying it was open. We pulled in, and as soon as we stopped, the sedan sped past us, continuing down the highway without even slowing down. I watched it disappear into the night, my heart still pounding in my chest. For a moment we just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. The fear lingered, thick and heavy, refusing to leave. Emily was shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, reaching for my phone with trembling hands. When I finally got through, I explained everything to the dispatcher. When she confirmed our worst fear, that the man wasn't a real officer, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a speeding ticket. We stayed at that gas station for a long time, waiting for the police to arrive. When they did, they took our statement, but there was little they could do. The man was gone, lost in the darkness of the desert. As we continued our trip, the excitement we'd felt at the beginning was replaced by a lingering sense of dread. Every time we passed a car on the highway, my heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night changed everything. The open road no longer felt like a place of freedom and adventure. Instead, it became a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just out of sight, waiting to pounce when you least expect it. Emily and I made it to New York, but the memory of that night haunted us for the rest of the trip. It was a reminder that not all dangers are easily seen, and that sometimes the real terror lies in the unknown.